So now that we've looked at the BerraQuotes server implementation, focusing primarily on the controller and the service and so on, let's switch over and take a look at the client. And you'll see that the client is going to do a couple of things. It's going to provide the overall structure of making calls to the server's microservice endpoint handlers. And it's also going to have this very interesting proxy mechanism in order to shield the bulk of your code, or the bulk of the client code, from the low-level details of HTTP programming. And you can find this here in that link, and we're going to walk through the code here in just a second. So we're now here in the client side of the program, the BerraQuotes application, and we're going to take a look at the BerraQuotes client and the BerraQuotes proxy. So let's load both of those things. So here's the BerraQuotes client. It is going to use Spring Web MVC features to perform synchronous remote method invocations on the endpoint handler methods defined in the BerraQuotes controller. And here's what it looks like. The BerraQuotes client is also marked as a component. And we use that marking so that Spring can do some auto wiring and dependency injection for us. And one of the things we're going to inject is something called the BerraQuotes proxy. So that's auto wired. We'll go look at that in a second. So this just says, find the BerraQuotes proxy and configure it, connect it. Let's take a look at the methods. These are really, really simple. We have the getQuotes method. This is the client side. And the client's getQuotes method is simply going to take the quote IDs and forward to the proxy. We have another method here called getAllQuotes. And the getAllQuotes method is just simply going to go and tell the proxy, hey, get me all the quotes. I want all of them. And then the final thing we have is the searchQuotes method, which takes the query. Let's say we're going to look for all the BerraQuotes that have the word baseball in them, for example. And that gets forwarded to the proxy. So you can see that the actual code here is very Java-esque, right? You don't see any HTTP calls whatsoever. You just see using a proxy to call another method that will do the grubby work. This is very similar to what we did on the server side in the microservice, where we had the BerraQuotes controller, which just kind of took stuff that was HTTP influenced and called the BerraQuotes service, which was entirely Java. So this idea of using proxies and controllers as a way to abstract away the details of HTTP programming is a nice pattern to apply. But eventually we have to pay the piper. So let's go take a look at the BerraQuotes proxy. This is the thing that actually does the low-level details. Even there, we're going to abstract away as much as we possibly can. So one thing that the BerraQuotes proxy is going to need is it's going to need a way to get to the server. And to do that, it uses an auto-wired field of type REST template called mRESTTemplate. And we'll see how that gets set up in just a second. But that's going to hide the details of getting connected to the server appropriately. Let's take a look at how that works. This is auto-wired. And if we go back over here to the server part, you can see that we have a components file. I could have moved this on the client side without any problem. We have a method, we do have a method. It's a bean called getRESTTemplate. And you can see that the getRESTTemplate bean returns a REST template. And the way it does it is it makes a new REST template. And then it goes ahead and it sets the address that we want this REST template to talk to be something called server base URL. And right here, this is what server base URL is. In this particular piece of code, it's localhost, because I'm running all these things locally on my laptop, at the port 9102. There are lots of other ways to do things, but that's a very simple one that we use. So that's how we get this REST template auto-wired to connect to the server. Notice that we don't really have to know the details of how all this stuff works. It just kind of does it for us under the hood, which is nice. Let's now go take a look at the different methods that the proxy defines. Remember, proxy is a good old design pattern from the Gang of Four book and other books like the Pattern-Oriented Software Architecture Volume 1 book, which basically says provide some shim between some caller and something that's probably running in a different address space. And rather than having the client have to know all the details of how to access something running in a different address space, let's make that the proxy's problem. So it's a very nice design pattern to abstract things away so that the bulk of your code knows little or nothing about low-level details like network programming. So how does this work? We have get all quotes, and it's going to use this handy-dandy reusable class that implements the Gang of 4 builder pattern, so yet another pattern, called URI components builder. And what that does is it's going to build a URL. And the URL is going to contain the information needed to communicate with the appropriate endpoint handler method in the microservice. And the way it's going to do that is it's going to create the path variable, which is really this routing ID. And that's going to be the get all quotes string. And so get all quotes, as you recall, just said all dash quotes. Remember, there was a corresponding endpoint handler method in the controller, the BerraQuotes controller, that had the same name. So that's how those things are getting associated with each other. So we say, put the path variable in here, which is this router, build the URI, and convert that to a string. Great. So now we have a URL that's going to have the portion that's localhost colon 9102 slash all dash quotes. That's what we have as the URL that we want to send to the server. How do we send it, you may ask? The way we do that is by using this very nice little abstraction that I wrote, which we'll look at in a second, called make get request list. And what this is going to do is it's going to use the REST template, so it knows where to talk to. It's going to take the URL that we just created, and it's going to indicate what the return type ought to be that comes back from the server, from the microservice, which in this case is going to be an array of quote objects as a class. So those three pieces of information are passed into this little helper method called make get request list. Make get request list is a generic static method, which is parameters by type T. In this case, that's going to end up being the parameters that we're passing in here for the request. And we pass the REST template, the URL, and the class of T, which in this case, as you recall, was the quote type. And we say, hey, REST template, go ahead and make a call. And here's the call. And an exchange is kind of a funky name. The way I look at it is it's like, I'm going to give you a URL. You give me back in exchange the results. I don't know why it's called exchange, but it's kind of a bizarre name. But what it's saying is, send a request at this URL, including this URL, including the URI portion of the URL, the path routing name portion, to using the get method with a null, ignore the request entity. And here's the return type I'm going to expect to get back, which in this case is going to be an array of quotes, because this is a generic type, and that's what it was passed to. So that's going to go ahead and call this method. It's going to give back a response entity, which is another thing built into HTTP, which is an array of type T, which is quote. So an array of quotes comes back. And then we simply use the list of factory method to convert the response entity body, which is an array, into a list. So we take an array of type T, which in our case is an array of quotes, turn it into a list of quotes, and that's what gets passed back. So the nice part is that all this low-level gobbledygook involving with HTTP is abstracted away into a very useful helper method, and we just call that helper method, and we get back a list of quotes. So that's what get all quotes does. The nice thing about get all quotes was there was no parameters. It was just basically the path or the router name. Let's go now take a look at the get quotes method, which takes a list of integers, and this will show some more refined and advanced features to make the appropriate URL. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the URI component builder, and we're going to pass in the get quotes string, which just says quotes. I want the quotes, please. And remember, there's a corresponding get mapping on the BerraQuotes controller. It's an endpoint handler that has the same name. And now we're going to create a query parameter. And this kind of comes back to the thing we were talking about earlier. This is going to have the quote IDs param. So what is quote IDs param? Quote IDs param is quote IDs. And if you go over here and look at the quotes, the BerraQuotes controller, you'll see that there is a name here called quote IDs. Those names have to match. So, in fact, I probably should, let's just leave it the way it is, but that has to be something that is matching. So we're going to make a query parameter, And we're going to give it a name, and then we're going to go ahead and give it a string. And the string is going to be the conversion of the quote IDs list into a string. And to do this, we're going to use a little helper method I wrote, which we'll look at in a second, called list2string. And list2string is also in this handy-dandy little webutils reusable class. And list2string is also a generic method. You can see it's parameterized by type T. It's static. And it takes the list, passes a parameter, converts it to a stream, then maps each element in the list of type T, whatever it is, in this case it's integer, to a string. And then we collect everything together, which is a terminal operation in this stream. And we use the joining collector. And what joining does is it puts a comma at the end of each of the strings that we're concatenating together. So we're taking a list of objects of type T and turning it into a comma-separated string, which is exactly what we want to pass as part of the URL to the server. So that then is built into this URL string. We build it, we convert it to a URI string, and then we go ahead and call the makeGetRequestList method again, this time passing in the same REST template, passing in the new URL, and passing in the quote array class to indicate what we want, what we expect the results to come back as. So that's another thing that you can do, very cool. And then the third and final proxy we're going to look at here is the one that handles the queries for a given string that we want to get from our BerraQuotes microservice. This demonstrates a slight variation in the way in which you build the URL or the URI. We use the get, in this case, we use the get search string, which just says search, and then we say /query. That's that template variable we were talking about before. So we tag the query string at the end of the path. It's the very final piece of the path that we're making. We build that, make it a URI string, and then once again we call the makeGetRequestList helper method, passing that information in, and that will then go and send it over to the BerraQuotes controller, where the BerraQuotes controller will say, aha, the get search string matches that endpoint handler method that was annotated with that get mapping /query parameter, and then it goes ahead and calls that method and passing that in as a path variable parameter. So that's the end of the walkthrough of the client code.